So the key question that historians like to argue is, did Mao create a totalitarian state? If I'm giving evidence that yes, he did, a lot of it would be that the CCP did create democratic principles, but in reality, everything was controlled by the state. Mass movements, local committees, rectification campaigns, re-education camps. The army was used to secure dominance over the people, and so as a result, it's hard to not argue that it was a totalitarian state. What a lot of historians like to argue right now is the nature of Mao. Did the good outweigh the bad? You'll see that time and time again. I don't even know how to answer that question. I mean, if we apply that question to everyone, then we have to rewrite all people who committed mass murder for ideology. Okay, so are the Crusades, did more good happen than bad? What? I don't even know where to go with that argument, but that's the current one. I think that what distinguishes Mao here is he did create a government in which it appeared that there was some openness, that people had a say, that they could form into party groups and they could, influence politics, in this early time period, at least when he's busy with the Korean War and other foreign policies decisions. You see multi-parties allowed. As a result, even in 1954, when a formal constitution is established in China and you get the National People's Congress, there is an appearance of freedom. Everyone in the entire population of China was formed into groups, whether they be in your village or your street or your office or your factory or your school. They were required to meet and they were required to talk about policies. So it almost appeared like there was this movement to organize people and at least as long as they followed Maoist ideology, it looked like they had some kind of influence in official decisions. This is all not true, though. In the end, especially as Mao became more powerful, all of that's going to go away. By 1966, it disappears altogether. So, as I said before, in 1949, Mao is still trying to establish control all over China. First of all, the British still have Hong Kong. They're going to keep it till 1997. Same with the Portuguese, Macau. These are islands that lay off. So, they're out of it. Then there's outer Mongolia. That is not in the control of Communist China. And then especially Taiwan. And then a few smaller islands that lay outside their control. Mao's plan to invade Taiwan at the end of 1950 was called off because of the outbreak of the Korean War. So he had a plan in place, and one of those historical mysteries is why he never invaded Taiwan. Anyways, to establish internal control, Mao's government called on ethnic minorities to identify themselves and promised them a degree of autonomy. 400 ethnic groups did so. From these, officials created 50 groups, which were then placed under military supervision and forced to accept communist rule. This will not be the first time he does this, where he's like, hey, here's a cool rule. Out yourself. Murder, murder, murder. But that's beside the point. One of the strongest places of resistance was going to be in Tibet. It took 6 months to crush, and it was a very cruel one. As you know, the religious leader of Tibet, was forced to flee. He now lives in India, and that is the Dalai Lama. But anyways, that was really bad. And then not only that, they forced a lot of Tibetans to move to other areas. I mean, Stalin's going to do this in Russia, by the way, where he forces ethnic groups to move out of their homeland somewhere else. And then he's going to populate Tibet with Han Chinese. As a result, this is still an issue today, much like the issue with Taiwan. So the living standards did improve for the average Chinese citizen, and that was going to be a first time in a long time in which every citizen felt like they were at least, doing well. I did look up homeless statistics in modern China just to see if they had a problem with displaced people or people without homes, and yeah, they do. By the way, so I wondered if an idyllic communist country, as they claim to be, would also still struggle with poverty and homelessness. They do. But anyways, at this time, this was, much better, and people put up with a lot, remember, from their government when they feel more secure. He also is going to eradicate a lot of the gangs, a lot of crime. When getting caught meant death, it curbed a lot of crime. He's going to get rid of opium, and actually quite a few diseases are cured because he forces inoculation on his population. So for the first time, a lot of people had job security and a stable income, and public health improved. And so, again, they put up with a lot. Here's my freedom. I don't care. I'm just going to go about living my daily life. And that's what happened here. Just a side note here, the Han Chinese were the dominant Chinese race. They're also the largest ethnic group in the world, comprising 92% of the population of mainland China. Also, party cadres were important at all levels of government and administration. They especially worked in the legal system, in education, and in the People's Liberation Army. They organized the mass organizations and local committees and meetings. They provided means of surveillance for the government, by the way, and helped implement control. In return, they received an iron rice bowl, which is just basically guaranteed employment and income for life. I want to make a note before I talk about this that if you read enough Chinese history, look at their early literature, which is just so much fun to read, by the way, it's amazing. You're going to notice a trend that basically merchants and landlords were never really liked in Chinese society, especially within a Confucian system, which I'll talk about in a little while. They weren't productive. They didn't give to the land. They took from it. They took from hardworking peasants. So anytime a leader, an emperor, Mao in this case, gets peasants to attack landlords, it's not that hard of a stretch. It didn't need a new political ideology of communism to make this happen. That's at least, again, my argument. Throughout history, Chinese peasants have had a lot more power than anywhere else, I would argue, with the exception of maybe Germany. German peasants had a little bit more power, but otherwise, they destroyed empires. They took down emperors when they got upset, and they certainly attacked landlords. So under Mao, these mass mobilization campaigns were really used as a way to bring people out and get rid of anybody who might have opposition. In those first years after the Civil War, Mao was forced to work with bourgeoisie. He did not want to tank his economy, but as time progresses, he becomes a little more murdery, basically. Intellectuals, university professors, teachers are always going to be the first victim of fascism, totalitarianism, extremism. You do not want anybody in your society who teaches people to think for themselves. So let's keep that in mind, right? I mean, automatically, anybody that's like, well, actually, would be the first to die. Now, between 1950 and 1952, there were four mass mobilization campaigns. The first one was to resist America and aid Korea campaign. This was to get most of the population suspicious of any foreigners, particularly from the West. They singled out the U.S. because of its involvement in the Korean War. And many foreigners, including missionaries and anybody that was Christian, was going to be attacked. Christian churches were closed, priests and nuns were kicked out. By the end of the 1950s, the country was closed to all foreigners except Russians. And by the way, in the 1960s, it closed them to that as well. But anyways, any kind of institution linked to the West was going to be closed down. Then next, once you've done that, you've attacked outsiders. Now you go to the people you want to attack inside. And so you get a counter-revolutionary campaign, and this focused on killing anybody with links to GMD, criminal gangs, or any kind of religion. Next, you get a campaign against corruption, waste, obstruction, so you turn against government officials. And this keeps going on. They start to just widen it with both of these campaigns in 1951 and 52. So you can see that a lot of this was going on. And what they were using are these things called struggle sections, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But it was all a way of just kind of riling up the masses against the different classes that might oppose Mao in the future. A struggle session refers to an accused individual being taken before a panel, usually in public, to listen to a catalog of their alleged crimes and moral failings. They were deliberately humiliated and required to look down. That reminds me of how people had to talk to the emperor, but okay. Anyways, sometimes guards held the victims in the jet plane position with the head down and arms thrust back. They had like signs around their necks and wore a necklace of ping pong balls to symbolize their bourgeoisie love of jewelry. And then they were beaten with bamboo sticks. They were expected to make a full confession and agree with their accusers. This sounds awfully like the Inquisition in Europe, too, as well. Also note that the fines imposed on businessmen during the mass campaigns were often used to push them into going state-private. Private owners sold part of their business to the state, and a state manager was appointed to work alongside the private businessmen. In early 1954, Mao began the first purge of the CCP. It followed a debate with his next 5-year plan. I think some people are already like, whoa, wait a minute. This does not sound good. And in light of what happens, they were correct. Anyway, so there was a debate. And during some of it, especially like, for instance, Gao Gang, who was already, an important leader in the CCP, had backed Mao against Zhao Enlil and Liu Shikai. And so as a result, he did support it. I mean, at one point, but then he got a little too big for his britches and he put himself forward to replace one of Mao's old friends. And as a result, by 1953, both him and Rao Shuxi is going to be accused of underground activities. Gao Giang is going to commit suicide, and Rao Shuxi dies in prison. So, not great outcome for them. By 1954, the economy was strong, industry was going, agriculture was, going as well. Everything was going pretty well. The one-party state had been established with Mao in complete control. And so as a result, he thought it was time to, implement the next stage of attack. Oftentimes in a totalitarian regime, you don't want anybody that thinks unlike what the party is specifically saying to think. So now he's going to push to get towards the rest of that, to undo the economic, or at least put in social and economic communism. There was pushback, and as a result, Mao's going to become far more paranoid as time progresses. Okay, so he's going to announce this in 1957, really February of 1957. He's going to lift censorship restrictions and encourage open criticism of the way the party was working. So it looks great, right? He even made this big announcement about letting 100 flowers blossom so as to create a socialist culture in our land. Participation was slow at first, which turned out to be smart. And so February, Mao went even further and said that people could vent their criticisms as long as they were constructive among the people rather than hateful and destructive between the enemy and ourselves. In May and June of 1957, the central government received a whole bunch of letters. Magazine articles and posters appeared, and there were rallies in the streets. Students at Beijing University created a democratic wall and complained of political corruption, Russian influence, low living standards, censorship of foreign literature, economic corruption, and the privileged lifestyle of party cadres and the leadership of the CCP itself. Mao claimed such activity went beyond healthy criticism. In early July 1957, he called the campaign off. It didn't go so well. He reimposed censorship and orthodoxy. He had either achieved his aim on entrapment or severely misjudged the scale of criticism that the campaign would unleash. Historians again still like to debate that. So, with the 100 Flowers campaign, Mao may have wanted to experiment by allowing some democratic check on the party, spurring it to still greater endeavors. This is the view of Philip Short. Or He may have simply felt it necessary to provide an outlet for critics to let off steam. Zhang Qiang, however, believes that he intentionally set a trap to flush out intellectuals and opponents. That crackdown that followed the 100 Flowers campaign ended any criticism by the intellectuals, who never again trusted Mao. Around 500,000 were branded as rightist and subjected to persecution, ranging from imprisonment, time in labor camps, and spells in the countryside for re-education, to public shootings as a warning to others. Many just simply committed suicide. Piang Dehai joined the CCP in 1927 and participated in the Long March. He served in the Civil War and was a member of the Politburo, China's defense minister from 1954 to 1959, and marshal of the PLA from 1955. So he's a very important leader within Mao's early days, but Mao is going to remove him from all posts in 1959, and he's going to be placed under house arrest. He was brutally treated during the Cultural Revolution, beaten in public 130 times. Mao did command the loyalty of some, like Lin Bao, who replaced Piang as Minister of Defense in 1959 and led the PLA. Mao also had important support from Jiang Qing, his wife, Madame Mao, that's her name, and a group of radicals in Shanghai that really wanted to attack the bourgeoisie. But it was the Group of Five who really helped solidify the Cultural Revolution. This committee was established in January of 1965, and its goal was to continue the revolution in China's culture. It was led at first by a man named Piang Zhen. He was the fifth most senior member of the Politburo and the mayor of Beijing. However, only one of its members was a firm supporter of Mao. Their failure to act vigorously enough led them to the dismissal of Piang as mayor and the dissolution of the committee by May of 1966. In 1959, once it was clear that the Great Leap Forward had failed, Mao gave up his position as PRC chairman, and the mass mobilization campaign stopped for a while. Mao claimed this time away from public life gave him the opportunity to think and plan rather than worry about daily administration. However, Philip Short, the historian, has suggested that he still remained a powerful influence, and the purge of Piang Dehai in 1959 would seem to support this. In July of 1959, Piang had told Mao at the Lushan conference that the Great Leap Forward was a grave mistake and hinted that he did not approve of Mao's decision to break away from the Soviet Union. He may also have blamed him for the unsuccessful confrontation over Taiwan in 1958. His removal from the Politburo and his position as Minister of Defense set an example to others of the dangers of independent thought. From 1962, Mao again became obsessed by the fear that the party was turning on a capitalist road, and you see him kind of begin to attack the more moderate policies by Liu Shikai and Deng Xiaoping. He tried to mobilize the masses in the social education movement of 1962. However, it was not until 1966 that he had enough of a power base to launch the Cultural Revolution. The launch of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution brought a dramatic purge of Mao's friends. Mao mobilized the Red Guards, who were just simply a band of radical students, and ordered them to attack the Four Olds, thought, culture, practices, and customs, and remove bad elements among the party, teachers, intellectuals, and former bourgeoisies. Terrifying assaults were permitted, and the police were instructed not to intervene. Public denunciation, struggle sessions at which victims were expected to confess to their crimes, and mass mobilization were practiced in their most extreme form. Tens of thousands died in prison. During this period, Mao removed many of his opponents from the party and retook absolute control of party hierarchy. His cult rose to new levels at post 1966. First, he's going to purge that group of five. He's going to get rid of a lot of them. A lot of them are going to die in prison. As you already know, Deng Xiaoping is the only one that's really going to survive this. Instead, he replaces it with a group called the Central Cultural Revolution Group, which he packed with his own supporters, including his wife, Madame Mao. And so, as a result of this, it's just going to be out of hand, especially in the cities. And it gets so out of hand by 1968, Mao sends his Red Guards to the countryside to go terrorize them for a while, give the city people a break. Also, during this time, he's trying to struggle to find out who to trust and who to leave it to. He's in his 70s by now, almost 80s. So, furthermore, he was very concerned about rivals, but at the same time, who was going to be his successor. In 1969, his successor was a man named Lin Bao, but he's going to die in a plane crash over Mongolia. Actually, this is a very suspicious death. There was a story put about that he was planning a coup to overthrow Mao, and so this was a good death for him, right? Deng Xiaoping, on the other hand, had spoken in favor of new Chinese relations, so he couldn't be allowed back in. He wasn't going to be chosen. Zhao Enlai was somebody that was certainly could have been a great leader after Mao, at least in Mao's opinion, but he was diagnosed with cancer. So as a result, the Gang of Four, who's going to be the group that's going to lead or try to take over, tries to solidify their power as Mao becomes closer and closer to death. They want to make sure they're taking over after 1976. The Red Guards were just a group of radical students ready to just kill everybody. For instance, the Red Guards broke into Liu Shi's house and physically attacked him and forced him to write his own confession. Liu was removed from all positions and expelled from the party in October 1968. Again, he's going to die in prison by 1969 after being refused proper medical treatment. After Liu's death in 1969, power was concentrated in the hands of the CCP chairman, who was Mao, and he assumed the ceremonial duties associated with the head of state. Not until after Mao's death was a new head of state appointed. So, and also, by the way, the Gang of Four, this refers to a powerful political group created in 1974. It consisted of 4 CCP officials who oversaw the suppression of a wide variety of traditional cultural activities during the Cultural Revolution. Its members were Mao's wife and then 3 of his most loyal, who turned out not to be so loyal, followers. The propaganda system was central to CCP rule. One historian, William Bradbury, argues that the CCP set about it so good, so massively, and so intensely that they beat any other ruling group at this time. So anyways, this was controlled by a central committee who answered only to the CCP. It was its own department. And it was also commanded a network of local branches that were used for mass indoctrination. The aim was to bring about thought reform. They wanted everybody to think the same. So such, campaigns like the Great Leap Forward of 1948 and the Cultural Revolution, this is where propaganda is its most important. The PLA, which remained the largest army in the world, also helped indoctrinate and reinforce political messages. Propaganda was used to spread ideology, encourage activism, hold out examples of selfless model workers and soldiers. For instance, they created fictitious soldiers of civil war years who had a good sense of duty and love the Communist Party. Mao had lots of myths about him, as we're going to see. Propaganda was usually spread using posters, the media, the education system, literature, films, theater, music, radio, television, in the same way it's used today, by the way. It was also spread through worker or local groups, committees, and propaganda teams. There was a special emphasis on political study groups led by party cadres, where everyone would be persuaded of the value of a particular policy and then put that out. They also had a nationwide system of loudspeakers that reached every village. Reading newspapers was regarded as a political obligation. And of course, there was only one newspaper you could read, one television station, you know what I mean? Chairman Mao also made himself a central figure for reverence here. This is not unusual. This would not be a hard sell. The emperors had been revered as almost mythical figures throughout all of Chinese history. All Mao again is doing is the same thing that they were used to. So anyways, his culture, his quotes become, everywhere. They're so easy to find even today. And they were just persuaded to study his little red book and to just revere him in all ways. The PLA, or the People's Liberation Army, comprised 5 million soldiers in 1950, and despite a partial demobilization to release more men into productive work, still comprised 3.5 million soldiers in 1953. 800,000 conscripts were added each year, with each serving 3 years. This gave young Chinese men training in warfare and indoctrination into the communist ideology. The force itself served a propagandist role. Its achievements were celebrated and its heroes held up as role models. So propaganda is nothing without a constant sense of fear and uncertainty, and Mao's going to use all of that. He's never going to have like a very strong intelligence gathering thing like the KGB or the CIA. Instead, he's going to turn the people against each other. Remember, that's how oppression works. And he figured that if everybody's turning on each other, that was a much better way. And remember, this man was a student of history. He probably studied the Crusades, or excuse me, not the Crusades, but the Inquisition. And that is exactly what they did then as well. He would hold these public struggle sessions, which I'll talk about later. And then anybody that had any diverging thought was going to be sent to a re-education camp or just publicly killed. So he used public policing versus an official military wing of the government. So there was a legal system set up in 1954. It's supposed to have judges. It was supposed to enact legal codes. Each citizen was granted the right to a public trial and defense by a people's lawyer. And in theory, there was equality before the law. However, none of this was practiced until after Mao's death. During his time period, party committees actually replaced courts. And, I'm going to talk a little bit about the struggle sessions they did as well. So, and then Mao's going to launch, these campaigns to, kind of get people to admit everything. One of his friends' son later said, "Today Mao uses sweet words and honeyed talk to those whom he entices. Tomorrow he puts them to death for fabricated crimes." There were a network of labor camps, and it was just the idea of re-education through labor. It was created soon after Mao came to power. Initially, the CCP used Soviet advisors in establishing the camps, and, as in the gulags, prisoners were used as slave labor for back-breaking projects. On average, there were 10 million prisoners per year held in camps under Mao, and by 1976, there were more than 10,000 labor camps spread across China. Many of the worst camps were deliberately built in terrible regions with unbearable coldness or hotness, or in the desert. Food rations were dependent on confessions and turning other people in. Refusal could lead to solitary confinement, beatings, sleep deprivation. When prisoners were interrogated at night, threats were used against their families, signed confessions were used as well. Many prisoners just died from hunger or suicide. The camps also helped to terrify others into obedience. If a prisoner was executed, the family could be sent the bullet or even a bill for the cost of the execution. Even released prisoners faced a constant threat of rearrest, and families of those imprisoned were also deemed guilty by association. So looking at the historical debate over time, in the early days, you had a lot of people that thought he was profoundly moral, that he was different than Hitler and Stalin. These authors, though, were mostly writing before the Cultural Revolution. So you get like Jean-Paul Sartre, I don't know how to say his name, who really liked him, and Simone de Beauvoir, who claimed he was no more dictatorial than Roosevelt, and Edgar Snow portrayed Mao as a hero. But again, they're writing before Mao did the Cultural Revolution. Philip Short definitely really kind of likes him. He excuses some of Mao's excesses because one has to understand the context, which is of an autocratic tradition. So he kind of makes that argument that I make, which is Mao's no different. They're kind of used to being ruled that way. But he also called Mao a visionary, statesman, political and military genius who combined a subtle, dogged-minded, awe-inspiring charisma and fiendish cleverness to produce remarkable achievements for China. So Philip Short really liked him. So did Jonathan Spence. He claimed that despite the agony he caused, Mao was a visionary and a realist. Fagon and Mao, a reinterpretation, claimed that Mao grew increasingly original and creative when he set China on the road to fundamental change. However, Chiang and Holiday really hate him. This is kind of colored by her own story and her own family's story during Mao, who were attacked. But she's going to call him the worst mass murderer in history. And so is, by the way, Jasper Becker, who's going to say that he starved 30 to 40 million people to death during the Great Leap Forward. And again, Chang is going to call him the greatest mass murderer, putting him well over responsible for the deaths of 70 million people, more than Hitler and Stalin combined. Recent interpretation of Mao's rule would suggest that, with the benefit of hindsight, there was a lot to condemn. Mao implemented a doctrine that aimed not only to transform China, but to create a new socialist man. Mao achieved authoritarian power in order to impose this vision on the people, but it came at the cost of millions of lives.